Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to do kind of a special topic here. I'm going to do a series of one-off lectures. I've got a series that I'm developing, but mine's been a bit scattered with the move to France and all that. So I want to do a series of sort of more focused single topic lectures. And this one, as the title suggests, is on free will and determinism. However, I want to treat this as a way of thinking about how one thinks philosophically, so that's not too meta, because I think much, I would say, not all, but certainly a good solid 80 to 85% of the free will and determinism debate is kind of nonsense. It's a version of the why are unicorns hollow question, and it does not lead, as the Buddha was reputed to have said, it is the kind of question that does not lead towards edification. So I wanted to break this down in detail the way we rarely do, and really look at how these sorts of questions come into being, what kind of assumptions are made just to make the question possible to comprehend, and why even in the structuring of these kinds of questions, we tend to go very far awry, and all kinds of assumptions and biases and concepts are built in that we don't recognize unless we stop and take a lot more time to think about them than we usually do. And I was prompted to do this for several reasons, which will come up, I think, as we go along. But one of them is, I think the free will and determinism is sort of a fancier version of the debate or the famous question, which I've always hated, which is you're standing above a train track and there's a train coming along filled with school children, and it's going to crash and kill everybody because there's something wrong with the tracks. However, you're holding a switch on the train track, and you can switch it to a different track, which will save all the children and they won't die. But laying on that track is a passed out old drunk. And so if you throw the switch, then the train will switch tracks, kill the drunk, but save all the children. If you don't throw the switch, then all the children will die, but you'll save the life of the drunk. Now, these are sort of hypotheses that this just doesn't, it's just not that helpful, I guess. And my favorite answer to this I've ever seen was, I would rescue the children with a helicopter. And then the professor says, where did you get the helicopter? And the answer is the same fucking place you got the train, which exposes the degree to which this is an artificial imaginary construct. And if you let people place you into these sorts of artificial constructs without your consent, then, basically the rules of the debate have been set and you're kind of stuck. And I hate the kind of artificial construction that it seems unlikely for us to encounter in our lives. And theoretically, this makes us think deeply and reflect on our values and so on and so forth. But I just don't think it does. I've never found these convincing or all that interesting. And I feel that the free will and determinism debate follows this pretty closely. And I want to go through some of the issues that come up here. First, just to start off, there's about 7 or 8 of these, so keep track at home. First this is clearly a false dichotomy. The premise of this is that we live in a world that is either entirely determined by free will or is deterministic in every way. So you can either have free will or you can have determinism. Now, it's hard enough to prove free will and determinism to begin with, which we'll get to, but to prove it to the degree that absolutely either free will or determinism was completely dominant would be, I think, just simply impossible. It would to know with that precision that nothing that we do ever has any moment of freedom, is stochastic at all, or that the universe is so perfectly determined, right? How are we supposed to determine that? And so rather than looking at a world that is mixed, the framing of the question forces us to presume that we're living in an either-or scenario. And I just think, again, false dichotomy is a famous logical fallacy. And so anytime you see anything, any question, any proposition given to you that gives you only 2 choices that are mutually exclusive, be immediately suspicious of this, because it is not necessarily, but it's almost invariably very much a false, again, it's false dichotomy. In fact, one of the things that people say is, oh, well, you can't be a little bit pregnant. Oh, in fact, you can be a little bit pregnant. You can be like, this is with this huge debate about this. When does life begin? When does pregnancy begin? What does inception mean? What does fertile mean? Like, turns out you can be a little bit pregnant. Like, you're not either not pregnant or not pregnant. There's all of these possibilities and ranges of possibilities within that. And to pretend like that's not the case, of course, simply completely blurs the biological and sociological complexity of trying to comprehend what we mean by, for instance, pregnancy. So again, anytime you have an either or construction, probably it's a trap, and it's a very weak, at best, to totally misleading framing, and that should be questioned right from the get-go. So the whole framing of this makes me very nervous. Two is you have these three terms that are troublesome. So we have free, we have will, and we have determinism. And when people say, oh, it's free will versus determinism, they act as if we know what all three of these words mean, how they're being deployed, and that we're in a total agreement on what what constitutes these ideas. And it's not just to argue about definitions endlessly. However, these are very elusive terms, and there's perfectly possible to define these things in ways that would make me say, oh yeah, we absolutely have free will, depending on one set of definitions of free and will. And it's also possible to say, oh, no, if you want to define it this way, then I'm going to go with determinism, no problem. And so when these ideas are deployed, often what the arguments are is they are building in assumptions about the definitions of free and will and determinism that make their answers seem inevitable or very strong, rather than going, hey, we have this huge semantic problem, and that is to come to an agreement about what would determine free, what would determine will, and what would determine determinism. And then once you have those sorts of that ground rule set, you at least have an opportunity to make some progress, or at least come to some understanding of the subtleties and nuances of what you're trying to discuss. And as an example of each of these, I gave a lecture a little bit ago in which I said, we're freer, but people feel less free. And in the past, people were primarily slaves or peasants or serfs. And so today, I gave that lecture. And in thinking about it and talking to people, I was reflecting on what do we mean by free. And if you define free is, getting to do what you want when you want, and you're not, and lack of constraints. And so maximally free means you have no constraints. Minimally free means you have 100% constraints. Then one of the constraints we really run into in the modern world is we live in a very money-dense society, or most people in the modern world live in money-dense societies. You really have no choice but to use money. Now, in the very extremes, you can. However, for most people trying to get through their lives and move about in the world, you really do need money. And the degree to which you have to do things you do not want, and which, as my friend Brian suggested, or damages your health, right? You do what you want, or things that damage your health, in pursuit of money that allows you to continue to exist, that allows you to make decisions and operate in the world, is a constraint on your freedom. And as the world becomes increasingly money dense, and as the basics of like housing or food or shelter or healthcare become increasingly expensive, then your freedom becomes very much constrained. And so it could be, one way of thinking about freedom, if you think about it in this way, would allow you to go, oh yeah, so we have more money, we have more free time, we have more opportunity than we've ever had. However, that comes with this incredible new constraint. People used to not have these opportunities and freedoms, but they also did not have a money economy, or they didn't exist in it. And so they had a very different set of constraints than we do. And so while we may have in some ways more freedom opportunity, in other ways we may be more constrained, and that freedom be very much more limited. And so this is just a very simple example of how, if you think about a concept like what do we really mean by free, then it makes a big difference in what kind of conclusions or ideas that you can draw from that, and what kind of comprehension you can get from it. And so when people talk about free, they usually mean unconstrained. Now, this is silly. We are constrained creatures in so many ways. Gravity, biology. There are so many constraints on us that if people define free as meaning without any constraint, then we are necessarily in a deterministic world because we're under just an unbelievable number of constraints. Like, again, just biology, time, the laws of physics, the location, just the constraints. If you list all the constraints, it's going to be a very long list. And it might even become depressing at some point. But does this mean you have no freedom at all? Well, no, of course not. Just because you have a million constraints doesn't mean you don't have a million freedoms or a million opportunities or a million possibilities. You can both have a lot of constraints and a lot of freedoms. Of course, you can have a lot of constraints and few freedoms. So, these are not mutually exclusive things. So, but often people will start talking about the constraints and say, "Oh, we have no freedom at all. Look at all the constraints," and they list. And if you do that, and if you mean free means no constraints, then yeah, it's very easy to say, yeah, we do not have freedom because we always have lots and lots of constraints. Therefore, it's a totally deterministic world. Of course, if we're in a false dichotomy land. So just that's one brief meditation on freedom. But you can see how if you went down this road, it would become increasingly complex and subtle and actually might be helpful and enlightening for the debate, but rarely do people stop and do this. Then the next one is will. Of course, what do we mean by will? Generally, as it's posited in this debate, is the notion that I have the capacity to make choices as I see fit. Once again, this is the free part. So the free part is I have a range of things that I can do where I'm not constrained. And the will part is from that range, there is some aspect of myself integral to me as an individual that is able to choose from those. Even, let's just say flavors of ice cream, always a great example. While if I go to an ice cream store, I can't choose any kind of cake I want, but I might have 12 flavors of ice cream I can choose. So I have some constraints, but here's a range of possibilities. Now, my will, in theory, would say I prefer, say, strawberry ice cream over the other flavors that are available, and so I will exercise my will and choose strawberry. So the notion that you have an integral self who has preferences and dreams and ideas and desires, and that under certain circumstances, those preferences are manifest by you in a conscious and self-controlled manner, is this idea of will. Of course, the notion of the self, the complexities of psychology, how these are manifest, when our ideas and desires become conscious. There's a lot of often specious, but often some interesting research that suggests that we often make decisions subconsciously and only become aware of them retroactively in our conscious minds. And so some people say, oh, well, this proves that you don't have free will because you're already making the decision before you become aware of it, and you can't have free will if you're not aware of your choice. But does the willing have to be conscious willing? I mean, this is one of those things that people tend not to talk about. If I have lived a pattern and created a set of desires and have already thought about and contemplated and dreamed about something, when I encounter the opportunity, do I in the moment consciously have to decide, oh, I want strawberry? Rationally take a moment to pause. Or if I've already established this pattern, I've eaten strawberries, I know I like strawberries, is that a manifestation of my will that I've trained into myself? Is that not perhaps also a manifestation of will, but it's just a willing that has been accumulated and built up over time, and so my will doesn't always have to express itself consciously. So in any case, the notion of the individual and of willing and of psychology is, let us say, the subject of a vast amount. Vast is an understatement, an ocean, a Pacific Ocean of reflection, psychological research, philosophical ponderings of the first order. And to just throw will out there as if this is a fully comprehended, easy to understand, no problem term, and then say, well, free will versus determinism, which, is of course like free and will. And now we move on to the third term, and there's only three terms here, by the way. So you would think it would be easy, but when those three terms are free will and determinism, wow. Now the final one here is determinism, which is the notion that we in fact do not have any choice, that everything that we do is predetermined by the physical laws of the universe, and that we were just automatons acting out a predetermined script. Now, once again, depending on how you define determinism, if you say that we are purely 100% automatons, that we are the sort of functions of chemistry and biological processes that, if they were sufficiently well understood, would explain all possible futures and how humans would behave, blah, 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 this seems to be a bit of a stretch. But if you just mean by determinism that there are large forces that shape and limit our capacity for making decisions, and that we're often fooled, this would maybe very soft determinism, well, then this is a very different sort of claim. And it's often not clear to me which claim, how strong of the claim of determinism is being made. It's often just that, determinism, and they'll use some sort of soft deterministic language. And then at the end, the claim is like, therefore, determinism. But it's like, or was the conclusion like, we're constrained and we don't necessarily make all our decisions and all this? Or was it like, ipso facto, we are simply biomechanical machines with no agency whatsoever, and everything else is just mythological, and, we're essentially like a crystal, like we just grow and change to laws, static, nothing to do with us at all, basically, and that our sense of self is sort of this chimera that just is a psychological trick played on us by our own biology, right? Which, where in this deterministic range are we falling? And again, when you just use determinism as if it's a known and assumed idea, just like free and will, well, it makes it hard to know what conclusion you're drawing and how much evidence you would need to provide to come with that. So again, you have this simple seeming framing of a false dichotomy with three words which are rarely ever defined with any clarity. And so it's not even clear what conclusions people are drawing when they make either side of the debate. And even if we knew. So that's a couple of problems there. The language, the framing, the logical fallacy in the structure of the framing. But a couple other ones that are there as well is the answer is knowable. This is one of those ideas, right? Like, we structure this as, well, it's free will or determinism. Again, false dichotomy. And the suggestion is, of course, that we get to know this. And one of the great things about Kant, if you ever bother to try and read him, which is, again, troubling, in his Critique of Pure Reason, which is truly a great work, is he just really, it's a very problematic work in some ways, but the greatness of the work is he makes some very good arguments for the limits of what we can know. And I think it's a very reasonable proposition to say this is one of those questions that we may not be able to know the answer to. It may simply be unknowable. And so the assumption that we're going to frame this as this clear false dichotomy and that we're going to be able to determine this is often just assumed, right? It's just like, this is a knowable thing and I know the answer. But if you stop and ask, not which is right and which is wrong, but if you stop and ask, what are the conditions under which I would be able to definitively conclude that one of these premises are accurate? This is a whole different world, a subtle world, a difficult world. And if you start down that path and ask yourself, okay, what would I really need to understand and grasp and know and define and have evidence for to be able to absolutely say, or even not even absolutely, forget absolutes, with some certainty conclude one of these things? Well, the list of evidence gets complex fast. I mean, again, think about how much knowledge you would have to have about individuals, the function of psychology, the nature of agency, self-awareness. What does it even mean to be self-aware, to be intelligent, to make a decision? How do we stand sufficiently outside the system to have some sense of how the system is working? I mean, it's tricky. I mean, famously, one of the things that we don't know how to define is, intellect, life, the mind, right? Like the people use the word soul. We have a sense that we're alive, but nobody really knows what that means and what that sense of self-awareness and cognition and intelligence and all these terms that we kind of use somewhat interchangeably. To invoke different aspects of our sense that we are alive, that we aren't just biology, that we aren't just mechanistic. We have a very weak grasp on this. Hello, phenomenology. Hello, psychology, right? Once again. And you go, wow, how well would we have to know and define the nature of our own existence, soul's intelligence, to be able to then determine whether or not we have agency within the context of the constraints of the physical universe I find ourselves in, again, referencing Kant, and how much access do we actually have to that universe? In any case, Kant suggests not that much, or certainly not as much as we would want. It becomes a very difficult question when framed not is it this or is it that, but how much would we need to know, and how clearly would we need to know it for us to be able to find a solution or derive a conclusion? And you'll quickly realize, an answer that looked very close at hand suddenly fades off into the misty distances of ontology. By the way, the swamp of ontology, many have entered, none have returned. And you quickly end up there. You quickly, you hit epistemology, how do we know what we know? And then pretty soon you end up with the whole nature of being, ontology, at which point, no explorers have returned. The unknown country, as Hamlet said, I believe. Then another aspect of this, so that's 4 or 5, or forget where I am, 4 or 5, is that this question is important for some reason. And the fact that it's asked all the time and debated all the time makes it seem like it must be of value, as if knowing the answer to this would somehow provide us with some kind of insight that was helpful or meaningful or powerful or life-changing or any of this. And for the life of me, I can't come up with a single reason why this matters at all. And it just, it's like, okay, if you want to believe that the moon is made of green cheese, that's great. You know what? It turns out it doesn't matter. I mean, unless you're trying to land on the moon or you're running the space program, then it probably matters. Otherwise, these kinds of beliefs don't matter. If you want to believe the world is deterministic, great. If you want to believe that the world is, you have free will, great. It's not clear to me why this matters, except that people like to be right, in which case this seems to be more about trying to exert power and trying to extend a worldview that people have, rather than about anything helpful or insightful or life enriching or even, philosophically, subtle or advancing our understanding of the universe in any way. And so I think part of what's assumed when you hear these kinds of questions is that, this must be an important question, meaning that if we could make some progress on it, or if we could answer the question, which people keep claiming to have answered, I think speciously, then, hey, something good and amazing would happen. Honestly, maybe it's just my own limits because the problem bothers me, so I don't really want to imagine well, and that's, could be my own bias. I'm happy with that. But I just think it's the kind of question that does not lead to edification. It's not. We certainly feel like we have free will, and to tell people that the things they feel like are that they have are completely false. It's of course false, because at first you have to say, well, then why do they feel that way? And then what does it mean for them to feel that way? And then what are the results of the way that people feel about that? And the fact that people behave as if they have, even people who claim the world is deterministic, behave absolutely as if they have free will. And so, you just go on and on and on. And at some point you go, you know what? This might be a version of, was it a pomegranate or an apple tree in the Garden of Eden? People have been arguing about it for many, many centuries, but it just doesn't matter. I mean, it's A, it's mythological, and B, who cares? Does it really? What? Let's say it's an apple. Let's say it's a pomegranate. Let's whatever. Like, it doesn't. Having the answer doesn't help. Does not lead towards edification. So the assumption that the question is important tends to be built into these, and we rarely stop and go, yeah, that's not the kind. That's the kind of question that's just not worth all that much of my time. And then the notion that if we had a bunch of evidence, and that evidence added up to a suggestion that logically constructed that either free will or determinism was correct, what we're really doing there is saying, I believe Aristotelian logic. And that if I can demonstrate something within the framework of Aristotelian logic, then that thing is sufficiently well determined that I am able to then advance my program, advance my conclusion, and that I can force you to accept it through the power of my logic. And this is a question that was raised because, of course, I've been reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and this is a point that he raises in there, like, okay, why do we have to believe that? Why do we have to go with Aristotelian logic? Are there other kinds of logics? Are there other kinds of sources of evidence? Are there other goals besides truth, in this case, the notion of the truth of free will versus determinism and how we derive that? Does it really matter? Aren't there better things to pursue? And so I throw this out there because for some reason this debate seems to never go away. It seems to pop up in the popular. It's like one of these popular press philosophical debates, as opposed to what I think most philosophers are actually worried about most of the time. And I just think it's so easy to be misled by the false sense of that these are real questions, that they matter, that we know what they mean, that answering them would be powerful, and that we have to accept the implications of these sorts of structures. It's just wrong on every count. And so rather than actually creating a space for helpful and interesting and insightful philosophical introspection or conversations, perhaps even better, what they tend to do is narrow our minds, limit our focus, and subtly or powerfully try and shape the way we think about the world, which is in fact anti-philosophical. It is an attempt to constrain, again, limit our free, to constrain the possible views that we can have about how the world functions, how we function within it. And the thing about the free will versus determinism or other similar debates is all of these are simply built into sort of the title. If I accept let's do the free will versus determinism debate, I've accepted pretty much all of these premises, all of which are super suspect, and now I find myself kind of in this corner. And if you've ever had these kind of debates or been to philosophical clubs or something where these are up for grabs and these sort of faux important questions are being bandied about, and you find yourself frustrated, or you feel that it's limited, or that for some reason this isn't helpful and you don't know why because this is supposed to be an important question, I think this is a big part of it, that it's really not an important question. The framing of it is incredibly limiting, even though we don't know it intuitively because we're not used to thinking about it this way, but you can feel it. Your mind just starts like rebelling, like no. And then you can tell that someone's just trying to convince me or something, or force me to accept the rightness of something that just doesn't seem either important or necessary or in any way convincing. And so not just for the free will or determinism debate, but for any kinds of question like this, when people are framing philosophical questions, you can just ask yourself this sort of series of questions really quickly. Like, one, would knowing the answer really matter to me? If it doesn't really matter to you, it's probably not worth your time trying to figure it out. If it does matter to you, then it definitely is time worth figuring it out. Two, does the framing make sense? Is it a false dichotomy? Is it unnecessarily narrow? Too many assumptions are built in that I want to start further back in the discourse? Do we understand and agree roughly, for at least the sake of conversation, about the major terms, like can we get there? And if you can, this is also often super helpful if you understand and can concur on the major terms of what you're discussing. And then if so, if the question is important to you, and you can be in a conversation where you kind of understand or explore the ideas and nature of the terms that are being used, and the framing is sufficiently open, then probably you can make some really meaningful headway, not in the sense of answering, but in the sense of comprehending. And for important questions, I think often just understanding or deepening our understanding of them is really where the power comes from, where you get a new insight or a new nuance, rather than a conclusion, this is done, put it on the shelf, go to the next one, which is sort of the manufacturing version, perhaps, of philosophical inquiry. So, a short disquisition on free will versus determinism as an example of an alternative way of thinking about philosophical questions that I think make dialogue, introspection, research, and understanding much more fulfilling and rewarding, rather than just trying to debate right and wrong and who has the power and who can force whom to accept what conclusions, which I always find to be sort of tedious and unhelpful. So, thank you very much.